What happens when the woman you love chooses wealth over you, only to return years later in tears? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of justice written by time itself. Today on Cheating Stories 7, we dive into a drama where love, greed, and revenge collide. If you're ready for a story that will shock you, move you, and leave you questioning what you would do in the same situation, then stay until the end. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 for more stories just like this. Now, let's step into the unforgettable journey of She Left Me for a Millionaire. 5 years later, she crawled back in tears. Noah Pierce came back to the coast the way a tide returns. Slow, deliberate, carrying small fragments of himself with every mile. Harbor Ridge had not changed much. The docks still smelled of rope and diesel, gulls still heckled the morning sky, and the pharmacy clock remained stubbornly 5 minutes fast. He rented a modest condo with a narrow balcony, and more often than not, fell asleep over patient charts spread across the kitchen table. It was supposed to be a season of maintenance. He fixed cabinet handles that had loosened, relearned street names that used to come easily, and memorized the quirks of the clinic's X-ray machine. The city had trained him to rush. Harbor Ridge trained him to absorb, yet solitude hummed through the drywall. After a week of good behavior, he let Mason talk him into meeting the guys at the docklight. The docklight wore new lamps and darker wood, but every booth still carried the weight of secrets. Noah was absently turning a coaster when the bartender arrived, moving with the easy confidence of someone who knows the room will inevitably choose her. "What can I get you?" she asked. He looked up, and the past snapped into focus. Lila Monroe had once been the rumor that traveled through high school corridors on the shoulders of other people's stories. Back then, she was a geometry problem he could never solve. Now, under softened bulbs, she looked less like a rumor and more like undeniable proof. She recognized him first. "Westbrook High, right? You fixed the film projector when Mr. Cohen melted down." He laughed, surprised at the accuracy. She poured a pale ale and asked where he'd been hiding all this time. He said the city. He said the animal clinic on Briar Street. He even mentioned mortgage pre-approval, and only later wondered why he had said that last part at all. Conversation found its own current. Lila adjusted the distance between stools so it felt like permission. She teased his earnestness and revealed just enough of her fatigue with late nights to suggest a secret she might be willing to share with someone safe. Noah did an old human calculation. Beauty plus history plus relief equals destiny. At closing, when the lights came up, she leaned across the bar and asked for his phone. "So you don't keep fixing projectors alone," she said, typing her number and adding a tiny lightning icon. He tried not to name what he felt. Naming makes things real, and real things can break. The harbor air cooled the heat behind his ribs. He told himself he had time, which is what people say when they secretly believe they have luck. A text arrived at 1:12 a.m. "Good to see you, vet man." What Lila took from the night was different. Where Noah heard a bell calling two lives into the same room, she heard the click of potential aligning with opportunity. Stability, salary, schedule, the steady patience of a man who always showed up on time, looked like shelter when your world was built on tips and charm. She hadn't planned anything that evening. She only recognized a door and made note of the hinge. They met for coffee 2 days later. Noah talked about cases that stayed with him, the three-legged shepherd who didn't know he was missing anything, the parakeet that cursed at the ultrasound machine. Lila talked about painting. Windows were her subject, she said, which made him like the idea of her more than the evidence. He asked to see her work. She smiled the way someone smiles when a child asks for the moon. "Soon," she said, and he believed her because that is what you do when the story you want feels within reach. Numbers became hours, then a small orbit of habits. His texts before dawn, her replies after midnight, a running joke about being out of phase. Mason asked, carefully, if he was ready. Noah said readiness is just fear that learned to dress itself. He chose faith in the oldest disguise, familiarity. Harbor Ridge makes second chances look like the logical conclusion of patience. By the time Noah noticed the new boy line at the marina and wondered who had paid for it, he had already stopped thinking about endings. Lila had already begun tracking beginnings, the clinic's expansion rumor, the lender courting first-time buyers, the way his face softened when he said the word home. Two people, one evening, one exchange of numbers. He thought the current was carrying them toward each other. She knew currents carry many things, and some of them are boats. Noah Pierce had always been cautious, deliberate, the kind of man who read contracts twice and saved grocery receipts just in case. But with Lila Monroe, caution unraveled thread by thread. Their first dinner blurred into a week of late-night drives, morning coffees, and stolen hours that refused to be contained. Nostalgia hardened into velocity, and what began as a quiet rekindling became a sprint. When you run towards someone at full speed, it is easy not to notice the ground tilting beneath you. Within 5 months, Noah bought a ring. It wasn't extravagant, his grandfather's old band reset with a modest stone, but the gesture was bold, almost reckless for a man who measured life in careful increments. Mason, his oldest friend, tried to steady him. "You're building a house on wet paint," Mason warned, half joking, half afraid. Noah brushed him off. Destiny, he told himself, doesn't wait for perfect timing. Destiny arrives on its own schedule. The wedding was small, a garden strung with fairy lights that cost less than they looked. To Noah, the evening glowed with promise. His family danced on the grass, neighbors raised glasses, and relatives whispered about how fast everything had moved. Lila dazzled in lace, her smile wide enough to hide both nerves and impatience. For her, the vows were less about devotion and more about trajectory, Noah's rising paycheck, his steady career, his predictable kindness. Not long after, she quit bartending. "I want to pursue art," she said one morning, gesturing toward canvases stacked in the corner. Noah, eager to support her, converted their spare bedroom into a studio. He bought easels, brushes, paints in colors she never opened. He believed inspiration would eventually come if given space to breathe. Days passed, then weeks. The canvases remained blank, their silence sharper than any argument. Still, Noah loved the routine. He cherished quiet breakfasts, long clinic shifts, and the comfort of knowing his life had shape. Lila, however, grew restless. She thrived when talking about parties, luxury cars, and stories of wealth, worlds far removed from the modest bungalow they called home. From the outside, their first years looked enviable. Steady paychecks, a warm house, photographs of matching smiles posted on holiday cards. Friends congratulated him. Family envied them. But beneath the photographs, hairline cracks spread across the surface. Lila's laughter was too sharp, her gaze wandering toward what lay beyond. Noah, blind with devotion, ignored the unease. He told himself that cracks mend when a foundation is strong. What he did not yet understand was that foundations fail quickly when they are poured without patience. At first, married life unfolded with the kind of rhythm Noah had always hoped for. Morning coffee brewed in silence, clinic shifts that left him tired but satisfied, dinners where he and Lila debated what color to paint the spare room. For a time, the calm was enough. It felt like proof that stability could carry them through the uncertainties of passion. But novelty has limits, and silence can turn brittle when restlessness creeps in. Noah began to notice it in small ways. The way Lila sighed too loudly when weekends felt ordinary. The way her eyes wandered past the television, as though searching for a different life just beyond the walls. Noah worked long hours at the clinic. Emergencies didn't respect schedules. A retriever hit by a car at midnight, a farmer's herd needing him before dawn. His paychecks covered the mortgage, stacked the pantry, and left enough for Friday pizza nights. He thought responsibility was the truest proof of devotion. But devotion, he would learn, is not measured by bills paid or hours logged. It is measured by presence. Lila began disappearing for stretches of time. She called it looking for inspiration. She claimed artists needed air, movement, light. Noah wanted to believe her. He nodded and kissed her cheek when she came home, pretending not to notice the absence of sketches, the untouched canvases, the faint perfume of bars instead of turpentine. The silence of her studio grew louder every day. Then came the call from her old boss at the docklight. A corporate summit was arriving at the Whitestone Hotel, executives, investors, men who tipped heavy to feel important. Lila accepted the bartending job without hesitation. "It's temporary," she said brightly. "The pay is incredible." Noah told himself to trust her. Trust meant giving her freedom, didn't it? Supporting her meant not asking questions, but questions grew on their own. Nights stretched until dawn. Receipts appeared on the counter from shops he didn't recognize, champagne bottles from boutiques far from her supposed route home. Her phone lit up at odd hours, and she tilted the screen away with the casualness of someone who had practiced the gesture. Friends began to murmur. They had seen her chatting with men in tailored suits, her laughter pitched just a little higher, her hand lingering too long on polished shoulders. Mason asked Noah directly if he was okay if he noticed. Noah forced a smile. "She's networking," he said. "Bartenders flirt, it's part of the job." His voice carried confidence he no longer felt. But doubt is not loud, doubt waits. It seeps under doors and hides in door frames. It whispers during sleepless nights. By the third week of the summit, Noah barely recognized his own home. The house was quiet when he came in, her perfume stale on pillows she hadn't touched since morning. Dinner plates stacked untouched. The hum of the refrigerator louder than her voice. He reminded himself that paranoia ruins marriages. But each reassurance sounded hollow, brittle, ready to crack. He had built his life on trust, and now that trust felt like standing barefoot on ice. Thin, fragile, ready to shatter with the next step. By the fourth week of the summit, Noah was running on coffee and the brittle energy of a man sleeping alone in a house meant for two. Lila's schedule had become spectral. She slipped out before he woke, returned long after he was gone, and offered stories stitched together from half-truths. "Big shots tip better after sunrise," she said one morning, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek before vanishing again. The words lodged in his chest, jagged and unresolved. That Thursday, Noah woke earlier than usual. He lay staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing down like a weight. He decided he was done letting doubt gnaw at him quietly. He would go to her not in anger, but in hope. A peace offering disguised as breakfast. He picked up a croissant from the bakery near the clinic, golden and warm, and blended the berry smoothie she loved, honey instead of sugar. He imagined the way her face might soften when he handed it over. He imagined remembering, even for a moment, why he had chosen her against all cautions. The Whitestone Hotel gleamed in the pale morning sun. Glass walls caught the light like a blade. Noah walked in carrying the paper bag that smelled of butter and fruit, his shoes echoing on the marble floor. He followed the signs toward the bar, already picturing her startled smile, already rehearsing the relief of proving his doubts wrong. But the bar was dark. Chairs were stacked high. The air was cold, empty of voices. A handwritten note on the door read, "Closed at 1 a.m. sharp." Noah frowned, pressing his forehead lightly against the glass as though warmth or pressure could change the truth. He tried the handle, locked. The smoothie in his hand began to sweat, condensation sliding down his wrist. At the reception desk, he asked carefully, almost sheepishly, if perhaps the bar had stayed open later for the summit crowd. The receptionist, a woman with clipped vowels and eyes that measured every word, shook her head. "No exceptions," she said. 1 a.m. sharp every night, always." The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Noah nodded, muttered thanks, and stepped back into the sunlight. He pulled out his phone, snapped a photo of the locked bar, and sent it to Lila with a single line, "Where are you?" Minutes later, her reply lit the screen. "Leaving soon, be home in an hour." Noah stared at the message until the phone dimmed in his hand. The croissant was crushed against its paper bag, the smoothie lukewarm. He sat in his car, the silence louder than traffic outside, and felt something shift inside him, something subtle but final. Suspicion, once a background noise, had sharpened into certainty. Lila had lied not once, not twice, but as a pattern, a rhythm, a design woven into the fabric of their marriage. His jaw tightened. He typed slowly, each letter deliberate. "We need to talk at home." The drive away from the Whitestone felt endless. The paper bag on the passenger seat looked less like breakfast and more like evidence, proof of innocence wasted. His hands clenched the steering wheel, anger rising in waves, steady, unstoppable. Trust does not collapse with a scream. It dies quietly behind locked doors and empty rooms until nothing is left but silence. Noah drove home with the weight of the Whitestone pressing heavy against his chest. The smoothie cup rolled across the passenger seat, dripping condensation into the upholstery. Every mile between the hotel and the house felt like a noose tightening. He had rehearsed questions in his head. Where were you? Who were you with? But by the time his car slowed into the driveway, the questions felt useless. Answers were already waiting. The front door opened to silence, not the comforting kind, but the kind that announces absence. And then he saw them, 3 suitcases neatly lined beside the wall like obedient soldiers. They weren't the kind of bags you pulled out for a weekend trip. They were the kind you packed when you did not intend to return. Noah's throat constricted, dry and heavy as he closed the door behind him. Lila sat at the kitchen table, posture rigid, eyes locked on the wood grain as though she were reading from a script. She didn't flinch when Noah stepped closer. For a long beat, only the refrigerator's hum filled the room. "What's going on?" His voice was sharper than he intended. She inhaled slowly, shoulders rising and falling. "I got an opportunity," she said, testing each word like it might collapse under its own weight. "An opportunity." His laugh was hollow, bitter. "At the bar, at the summit. What kind of opportunity packs 3 suitcases?" Her lips trembled. She tried again, but Noah slammed his hand flat against the table. The sound cracked through the kitchen, making her jump. "Stop lying," he said. "Say it out loud." Her eyes filled, and then the truth slid out, fragile but sharp. "It's Victor Hale," she whispered. "He asked me to come with him. He can give me more than this, more than you ever could." The name cut through Noah like glass. Victor Hale, a man weighted with wealth, property, status, the kind who collected people like cufflinks. Noah staggered back, his mind reeling. All the late nights at the clinic, the careful savings, the small sacrifices that he believed proved love, none of it mattered. "I deserve more than this town," Lila continued, her voice cracking but still determined. "I can't waste my life stuck here living small. You're safe, Noah, predictable, but I want more, I need more." For a moment the room tilted, then anger surged, hot and uncontrollable. "So that's it," Noah shouted. "I was just a placeholder until something shinier came along. You used me, Lila. You drained me dry, and the second someone richer smiled at you, you tossed me aside." She pushed back her chair and stood, her face streaked with tears but her jaw clenched with defiance. "Think what you want. I'm not sorry for wanting a better life." With that, she grabbed the handles of her suitcases. The wheels scraped across the floor, the sound louder than her crying. She didn't look back as she opened the door. She didn't pause to see the man she was breaking. The house swallowed the silence again, deeper now, heavier than before. Noah stood staring at the empty space where the luggage had been, at the door left ajar. The kitchen table, the packed suitcases, the absence of her perfume, everything looked like a crime scene without a body. He sank into a chair, trembling with rage and grief, realizing a truth in its rawest form. Betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder. It waits, patient and sharp, and then it cuts in a single decisive strike. The days after Lila's departure blurred into movements without meaning. Noah woke, fed the dog, showered, and went to work. He stitched torn skin, prescribed antibiotics, comforted anxious owners, all on autopilot. His hands were steady, his voice professional, but inside he was hollow. At night, when the clinic lights dimmed and the streets fell silent, the house became unbearable. Every room hummed with her absence. The studio she once claimed as her sanctuary was now a mausoleum of blank canvases, lined up like gravestones. Each one whispered a reminder of promises that were never real. Weeks passed before Noah made the decision. The house had to go. He signed papers with hands that shook, watching strangers tour rooms where he had once believed a marriage was growing. When the sold sign finally went up in the yard, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like surrender. He moved into a smaller bungalow across town. The floors creaked, the paint peeled, and the roof groaned in storms. But it was his, and unlike the last house, it didn't echo with betrayal. Therapy became his reluctant refuge. At first he sat in silence, arms crossed, answering questions with shrugs, but little by little words spilled out. Shame, shame for being left, for being blind. Guilt, for missing the red flags, for convincing himself that love was enough. His therapist told him that healing wasn't about rewriting the past, but surviving it. The sentence stayed with him, repeating in his head on the drive home like a mantra he wasn't ready to claim but couldn't forget. Work filled the gaps therapy left behind. Noah volunteered for more shifts, stayed late, and built a reputation at the clinic for being the man who never said no. The local paper even ran a feature, "The Vet Who Never Quits." Reading it, he didn't feel pride. He felt something smaller, steadier, the fragile scaffolding of a life being rebuilt. Evenings were still the hardest. He would sit with his dog, listening to the heater crack and groan, and hear echoes of Lila's laughter, fragments of arguments replayed in his head. But over time, the echoes dulled. They became background noise instead of open wounds. Mason visited often. They sat on the porch with beers, Mason talking more than Noah, reminding him that scars don't vanish, but they prove survival. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Lila was stepping into Victor Hale's glittering world. She wore gowns worth more than Noah's car, flew first class, posed for charity galas where her smile looked expensive. Social media framed her as radiant, untouchable. But Noah didn't see those photos, and maybe that was his salvation. His eyes were turned inward, toward the small victories of showing up, of breathing through another day, of not letting grief dictate every step. Each quiet night spent alone, each therapy session endured. Each kindness offered to a stranger's pet became the groundwork of a future she would never touch. The paths had diverged. She was chasing extravagance. He was learning resilience. And though Noah couldn't see it yet, every step he took in silence was carrying him farther from her shadow. Time softened the jagged edges of Noah's life in ways he had once thought impossible. 5 years after Lila wheeled her suitcases out the door, Harbor Ridge looked the same, yet it felt entirely different. The town hadn't changed. He had. The small bungalow he once bought in grief now thrummed with warmth. The creaky floors that once echoed loneliness now carried lighter footsteps, June Whittaker's. June was not lightning the way Lila had been. She was a steady flame. A nurse with sharp wit and a softer heart, she met Noah at a community vaccination drive. She teased him when he fumbled syringes after a shepherd mix barked too loudly, and he laughed in a way he hadn't in years. Friendship grew slowly, then sturdier, built not on nostalgia or performance, but on candor. She asked questions he once avoided, about the divorce, about the guilt, about the shadows of betrayal, and she did not flinch when he told the truth. With June, honesty didn't feel like a risk. It felt like relief. By the time they married, Noah no longer thought of himself as the man left behind. He thought of himself as a man who had survived and, more importantly, rebuilt. Their home was modest but sunlit, its kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and laughter that didn't have to be earned. June stood there one morning with a hand resting gently on her rounded belly, smiling at the life inside her. Their child, due in weeks, was proof that love could grow again, even in soil once scorched. Noah watched her heart steady, grateful for the quiet miracle of second chances. For years he had carried the weight of betrayal like a scar across his chest. Now that scar felt like something else entirely, not a wound, but a mark of survival. But peace, Noah would learn, is fragile. One evening after clinic hours, he set his phone on the counter while chopping vegetables for dinner. When he glanced at the screen, it was lit with a notification from an unknown number. Then another, and another. By the time he wiped his hands clean, a barrage of messages filled the display. "Noah, it's me. Please answer. I need to see you. Urgently. I'm back in town. Please don't ignore me." He froze. "Me." The word alone was enough. He didn't need the name spelled out. Only one ghost would dare resurrect itself this way, Lila Monroe, for a long time. He simply stared at the screen. The kitchen hummed with June's kettle boiling, the dog's tail thumped against the floor, the soft rhythm of ordinary life filling the room. A life that had nothing to do with her. His thumb hovered over the delete option. Part of him wanted to erase the words like junk mail to bury them forever, but persistence has its own poison. The texts kept coming through the next day, each more desperate, each tinged with urgency he could not quite ignore. Please, it's important. You're the only one I can turn to. That night, lying beside June as she slept, Noah scrolled through the messages again. Why now? Why after 5 years of silence? Why after she had chosen wealth over devotion, illusion over love? He set the phone on the nightstand, the glow dimming into darkness. But his mind refused to follow. For the first time in years, Lila Monroe's shadow re-entered his life, not as the glamorous woman who left him, but as a storm cloud pressing against the horizon. The peace he had fought so hard to build was trembling, and deep down, Noah knew the past had returned to test him. The decision to meet her felt reckless, but Noah told himself it was curiosity, not weakness. After days of relentless messages, he finally typed a single reply. 1 hour. The cafe on Main. His chest felt tight the entire drive, as though he were walking willingly back into a fire he had once barely escaped. The coffee shop was quiet that morning. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, laying warm squares across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. And there she was, Lila Monroe, sitting in a corner booth as if the last 5 years had been nothing more than an intermission. She looked polished but tired, makeup layered too carefully, eyes darting toward the door each time it opened. When she saw him, she smiled instantly, wide and practiced. "Noah," she said, rising slightly as if to embrace him. He extended only a hand, polite but firm. The hesitation on her face lasted a second before she gestured to the seat across from her. The first 10 minutes were strained, small talk. She asked about Harbor Ridge, about his clinic, about his parents. Her voice carried an old rhythm, as though she were trying to step back into a role that no longer fit. At one point, she brushed her hand across his, pretending it was nothing more than habit. Noah pulled back gently, his expression steady, unmoved. Finally, the mask slipped. Her shoulders sagged. She exhaled as though the performance had drained her. "I need your help," she admitted. Noah leaned back. His tone was flat, not curious, not cruel, just factual. "How much?" She blinked, startled. $5,000, just a loan. I wouldn't ask if it weren't desperate. Then the story spilled out, a fragile tower of excuses. Victor Hale, the man she had left him for, was gone. He had discarded her for someone younger, shinier, someone easier to parade in public. There was no alimony, no mansion, no safety net. She was broke, sleeping on couches, reduced to chasing favors from old acquaintances. Noah listened in silence. 5 years ago, her tears would have gutted him. Now they sounded like a performance. "I gave you everything I had once," he said quietly. "And it wasn't enough. Why would I believe $5,000 would change that now?" Her eyes widened, breath catching. For the first time, the confident manipulator looked small, cornered, diminished. Around them life went on, cups clinked, milk steamed, voices rose and fell. To everyone else, it was just another morning in Harbor Ridge. To Noah, it was the day the balance shifted. The woman who had walked out with 3 suitcases was now sitting across from him with empty hands, begging for mercy she had never shown. And Noah, steady as stone, felt no obligation to bend. Silence stretched across the table after Noah's refusal, broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine. Lila twisted her paper napkin until it tore, her composure unraveling thread by thread. "Not 5 then," she whispered. 3, just 3,000, that would be enough for a deposit on an apartment, somewhere small, somewhere safe. Noah said nothing. His gaze was calm, unyielding, a wall she could not climb. The quiet forced her to keep talking, desperation spilling out in uneven waves. "I could sell some art once I get settled. I've been working on ideas, big pieces. A gallery in the city might take them." Her voice stumbled, more excuse than conviction. Noah leaned forward, folding his hands. "Show me," he said simply. "Pictures, sketches, anything." Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes fell to her chipped nails. I don't have anything," she admitted, the words dragging out like stones. "I thought I would. I thought the time would come, but I never really made anything." The final layer of illusion cracked. For years, Noah had tortured himself with the thought that he wasn't enough for her, that if he had been richer, bolder, more ambitious, maybe she wouldn't have left. But here she was, confessing that it wasn't love she had wanted at all. It was the security he represented. Her voice faltered again. "Victor promised me everything. He said he would take care of me. But he never proposed. He never gave me anything real. When he found someone else, he just shut the door, and now I have nothing." She looked up then, eyes shimmering with a plea that once would have undone him, but Noah's heart stayed still. "You didn't love me, Lila," he said evenly. "You loved what I could provide, just like you loved what Victor could provide. And now, with both gone, you come crawling back. Not for me, for what I represent." The words landed like a verdict. Her face crumpled, but not entirely from sorrow. There was anger, too, the raw realization that her old tactics no longer worked. Around them, the cafe buzzed with ordinary life. Coffee orders called out, spoons clinked against porcelain, conversations rose and fell. Yet inside that booth, something final snapped. The twist was merciless. The woman who had once believed she was ascending into a life of luxury had fallen so far she was begging the very man she discarded. And he, the man who once would have given her anything, now sat across from her, unmoved, unwilling, unreachable. And for Lila, it was devastation. For Noah, it was liberation. Lila's tears dried as quickly as they had fallen. Her posture shifted, spine stiffening, chin tilting upward. Noah recognized that look. It was the same mask she wore years ago whenever she felt cornered. Only now the stakes were sharper. "You know," she began, voice low but cutting, "I could take you to court. You think you're safe, but you're not. I never got a dime in alimony. I let you keep everything when we divorced. The house, the savings. Technically, I'm entitled to half." The words hit Noah like a fist. For a moment, his breath caught. Memories of paperwork, of signatures scrawled in black ink, of long hours spent dividing assets, all came rushing back. He had believed everything was settled. But what if she was right? What if the law still had claws? Lila saw the flicker of panic in his eyes and pressed harder. Her lips curved into something almost triumphant. "You think your new wife wants to deal with a lawsuit?" she continued. "Lawyers dragging your name through court, reporters sniffing around your clinic. I could make this very ugly. Or," she leaned closer, her voice softening into a mock sweetness, "you could just give me what I asked for. 5,000 is nothing compared to what you owe me." Noah stared at her, pulse hammering in his ears. For the first time since her return, fear edged into his resolve. Not fear of losing her, he had already lost her years ago, but fear of her chaos pulling him back into the storm he had fought so hard to escape. That night, long after the cafe had emptied, Noah sat at his desk, phone glowing in the dark. His hands trembled as he called Mason. "She's threatening court," Noah said, his voice unsteady. "Don't waste a second," Mason replied. "Talk to a lawyer tomorrow." The next day, Noah sat in a tidy office across from a calm attorney. He laid everything out. The divorce finalized 5 years ago, the sale of the house, the signed settlement. The lawyer barely blinked. "She has no case," the attorney said flatly. "Once a divorce decree is final, alimony can't be reopened in this state. As for the house, the proceeds were already accounted for. She forfeited her claim when she signed. She's bluffing." Relief washed over Noah like a tide, heavy and overwhelming. For the first time in days, he exhaled without pain. That evening, another message buzzed onto his phone. "Think about what I said. I won't wait forever." Noah didn't reply. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He gave her nothing, not even the satisfaction of her reaction. He blocked her number, deleted the thread, and set his phone face down. Lila's last weapon had collapsed under the weight of reality. Her threats were smoke without fire. And for the first time since her shadow reappeared, Noah felt untouchable. Not because she was finished, but because he had finally stopped giving her power. When Noah pressed the block button, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like closing a window in winter, necessary, protective, final. He blocked her number, her email, every shadow of her on social media. He deleted the thread of desperate texts, not to erase the memory, but to reclaim the space they had occupied in his phone and in his mind. For the first few days, he half expected her to appear at his doorstep, suitcase in hand, drama spilling into his driveway. But nothing came. Instead, whispers began to trickle through town. At the hardware store, Mason overheard someone saying that Lila had been staying with an old acquaintance, but was asked to leave after missing rent on the spare room. At the clinic, a client mentioned seeing her waiting tables at a rundown diner outside of town, hair unkempt, eyes tired. Someone else claimed she had tried picking up shifts at a boutique but was let go within weeks. Too distracted, too bitter, the owner allegedly said. Each account painted the same picture. The glitter had worn off. The woman who once walked into hotel lobbies with a millionaire on her arm was now scraping for odd jobs, her allure fading under the weight of consequence. Noah listened without asking for details. He nodded politely, but he didn't gloat. He didn't tell June. He didn't even allow himself the smugness of saying karma had done its work. Instead, he felt something quieter, relief. Relief that her chaos was no longer his problem. Relief that her downfall required nothing from him, only his absence. At home, life moved forward with gentle insistence. June's pregnancy entered its final weeks. The nursery filled with folded onesies, a crib Noah had assembled piece by piece, double-checking every screw. Evenings were marked by soft laughter, by Noah's hand resting on June's belly as their child stirred. Revenge, he realized, didn't always come in grand gestures or public reckonings. Sometimes it was simply living well. Sometimes it was silence. Distance and indifference had become sharper than anger, a blade she could not dull with apologies or threats. And as Lila faded into a shadow of who she once was, Noah's world grew brighter, not because of her suffering, but because he no longer lived under its weight. He had chosen silence. And in that silence, he finally found peace. By midsummer, Noah's life had settled into a rhythm he once thought impossible. The sleepless nights were no longer haunted by betrayal, but by the cries of a newborn. Their son filled every corner of the house with purpose, with noise, with joy. June, resilient even when exhausted, laughed through the chaos. One evening, after a long day of juggling bottles and diapers, they made a pact before fatigue could turn into frustration. They would celebrate small victories, a nap longer than 2 hours, a bottle warmed on the first try, a diaper changed without protest. It was these small victories, imperfect but joyful, that inspired an idea neither of them could resist: a road trip. The RV wasn't flashy, just practical, big enough for a crib attachment, small enough to handle winding state roads. They planned a loop through campsites and quiet lakes, a chance to breathe outside the routines of bottles and charts. Noah looked forward to mornings with coffee under wide skies. June dreamed of afternoons reading in camp chairs while their baby napped. 3 weeks in, with their son sleeping peacefully in the back seat, they pulled off the highway when hunger outweighed pickiness. The diner they found looked worn, peeling paint on the sign, a neon open buzzing faintly, but it promised hot food, and that was enough. Inside, the air smelled of grease and burnt coffee. A jukebox wheezed out old country songs. They slid into a booth, ordered quickly, and Noah excused himself to the restroom. As he washed his hands, voices carried down the narrow hallway. A man's voice, sharp and tired. "This is the 3rd complaint this week. Customers shouldn't wait 20 minutes for cold fries." Then another voice, softer, pleading, and instantly familiar, Lila's. "I'm sorry, I'll do better. Please, I just need this job." Noah froze, water running over his hands. The sound of her voice pulled him backward in time. Hotel lobbies, packed suitcases, the hollow weight of betrayal. And now here she was, reduced to apologies in a roadside diner. The manager's tone hardened. "One more mistake and you're out, last warning." Noah shut off the faucet, dried his hands slowly, and stepped into the hallway. At that exact moment, Lila emerged from the opposite door. Their eyes collided. Her expression collapsed into horror, a mirror of recognition she hadn't wanted. The fluorescent light made her look older than she had ever allowed herself to appear, apron stained, hair frayed, eyes swollen with fatigue. Noah didn't say a word. He simply adjusted his sleeve, straightened his shoulders, and walked past her. Back at the table, June raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Noah said, sliding into the booth. He glanced at their son, still sleeping peacefully, and smiled faintly. Everything's fine, but inside, he knew what he had witnessed, a surreal collision of past and present. The woman who had once abandoned him for wealth was now begging to keep a minimum-wage job. Fate, it seemed, had a long memory. The hallway outside the diner restroom felt narrower than it was, bathed in harsh, fluorescent light that flattened every shadow. Lila stood frozen, half-turned toward the manager who still loomed behind her, jaw tight with impatience. But the moment her eyes landed on Noah, the reprimand from her boss seemed to vanish. Her entire body stiffened as though she had been caught mid-theft. Noah stopped a few paces away. His pulse quickened, throat tightening for an instant, the old reflex to fill silence with questions, with pleas, with anything that might restore what was lost. But those days were gone. Instead, he stood still, steady, unreadable. Lila's lips parted. Perhaps she wanted to explain, to invent a story, to resurrect the charm that once bent him toward her. But no words came. Her voice failed under the weight of recognition. She wore a stained apron, hair pulled back hastily, cheeks flushed with humiliation. And there he was, composed, steady, a man who no longer belonged to her orbit. The manager cleared his throat, visibly irritated. "Get back to your tables, Lila," he muttered, brushing past Noah with a quick, apologetic glance. She flinched at the order, humiliation compounding in the narrow space. Still, her gaze clung to Noah, desperate, searching for even the smallest flicker of sympathy. Noah offered none. He adjusted his sleeve, took a calm step aside, and walked past her without a word. Her eyes filled, but she didn't follow. She couldn't. What could she possibly say? That she had traded him for a millionaire only to be discarded herself? That she thought his patience would always be her safety net, only to discover he had cut the rope years ago? When Noah returned to the booth, June glanced up from buttering toast. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Noah said simply, sliding into the seat beside her. He kissed the top of her head, glanced at their son stirring softly in his carrier, and let the moment pass as if it were any other. But deep inside, he understood something final had just happened. His silence wasn't cowardice, it was clarity. The clearest declaration that Lila no longer had any claim on his life, his voice, or his energy. The scales had shifted completely. He was free. She was trapped. And for the first time, Noah realized that revenge didn't need confrontation. Sometimes, the sharpest blade was indifference, wielded without a single word. When Noah returned to the booth, June was humming softly, spooning applesauce into their baby's mouth while the child gurgled with delight. The sight anchored him, pulling him away from the fluorescent hallway where old ghosts still lingered. He slid into the seat beside her, the warmth of her shoulder against his, and felt the noise of the past dissolve into something smaller, almost weightless. Moments later, the diner's manager approached. His voice was sheepish, his eyes apologetic. "I'm sorry you had to see that back there. We try to run a tight ship, but sometimes people don't pull their weight." He hesitated, then added, "Your meal's on us today, and please try a slice of our house pie. It's the least I can do." June smiled kindly. "That's very thoughtful, thank you." Minutes later, 2 plates arrived, golden crusts glistening, steam curling upward, the sweet smell filling their booth. Their son reached out a tiny fist toward the pie as if determined to claim his share. June laughed, her eyes bright, and Noah chuckled too. In that moment, the ordinary became extraordinary, a free dessert, a happy baby, his wife's laughter echoing brighter than any music. His gaze wandered briefly across the diner. Somewhere in the back, dishes clattered, voices rose, but there was no sign of Lila. Once she had embodied glamour. Once, her presence had filled rooms like a spark. Now she was reduced to apron stains and reprimands, hidden behind swinging kitchen doors. The contrast was sharp, almost cruel. But Noah didn't feel cruelty. He felt release. His life was defined by stability, love, and small joys, a family, a future, a peace earned through scars. Hers was defined by desperation and regret, a story unraveling in real time. June fed him a playful bite of pie, sweet and warm. Noah accepted it with a smile, realizing that closure wasn't found in confrontation or revenge. Closure was this: seeing without doubt the difference between the man he had become and the woman who had refused to grow. The lesson was simple but profound. He didn't need to seek revenge. Life had already written it for him, etched into the contrast between laughter at his table and silence at hers. The drive home from the diner was quiet, but not heavy. Their baby slept in his carrier. June leaned against the passenger seat with her eyes half closed, and Noah guided the RV down the winding highway with a calmness that felt unfamiliar, yet entirely his own. The scene in the diner still lingered, the flash of Lila's startled eyes, the stammer in her voice, the silence that had been louder than anything he could have said. But instead of anger, Noah felt stillness. For years, he had believed that revenge was fire, loud, consuming, dramatic, but fire always burns itself out, leaving only ash. What he carried now wasn't fire, it was clarity. Lila's downfall had not required his hand. It had unfolded on its own, consequence stitched to choice, karma written line by line into the ledger of time. She had left for wealth and status. And when those illusions collapsed, she had nothing left to stand on. He hadn't destroyed her life. She had. He thought about the years he had lost to grief, the nights of shame, replaying her betrayal like a film loop. How small he had felt, how foolish. Yet sitting behind the wheel now, with his wife beside him and his child breathing softly in the back, he understood something profound. He hadn't lost. He had been delivered. June stirred, reaching across the console to lace her fingers with his. Noah squeezed gently, his eyes fixed on the road, his heart steady. This was his justice, not watching Lila beg in a diner, not blocking her desperate messages, but building something she could never touch. A home rooted in honesty, a love free of performance, a future protected by resilience. He didn't feel triumph. He felt peace. Peace that he had survived her chaos. Peace that her shadow no longer dictated his choices. Peace that his son would grow up in a house untouched by betrayal. Justice, Noah realized, isn't always a hammer striking down. Sometimes it is time itself, patient and impartial, letting consequences find their way home. Lila had written her own punishment. He had written his own healing. And healing, he finally knew, was the sharpest revenge of all. And that concludes the story of She Left Me for a Millionaire. 5 years later, she crawled back in tears. In the end, betrayal always carries its own punishment, and sometimes the sharpest revenge is healing and moving on. What would you have done if you were in Noah's place? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story touched you, remember to like the video, comment with your opinion, and subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 for more unforgettable stories of betrayal, revenge, and lessons about life. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.